Greetings, fellow members of the Esoteric Order of Gamers. Welcome to another Esoteric review. And today we're going to be looking at Tyrants of the Underdark. It's by Gale Force 9. This is the new version. The lovely people at Gale Force 9 were kind enough to send me a copy of this game. I didn't even ask for it. They sent it to me. Isn't that nice? So let's have a look inside. I'll tell you all about it, and I'll also tell you what I think of Tyrants of the Underdark.
Firstly, what do you get in the box? Well, you've got this cardboard that you put cards on during the game. You've got a rulebook, of course, one of these big floppy square ones, which I'm not crazy about, but never mind, because I've done a rules summary and reference sheet. Here it is, it's done already. So that's the entire rules all on one side of a sheet. So you don't need this big rulebook, who needs that? You've got that. You can download it from my website, of course, at orderofgamers.com. It also comes with a couple of play reference sheets as well, like that. So grab it, print it, laminate it. You're laughing. You've got a board. Let's open this up. There we go. It's a board of the Underdark. It's basically spaces where you put your troops and try and win area control, but we'll get into that later. There are 4 of these player sheet things. They're nice and thick, which is good, not floppy cardboard, which I really don't like. This is where you put your deck. There's a little summary of play here. Other spaces to put things. It's kind of unimportant. You don't really need it, but it reminds you what colour you are. Now, I've already punched out all the counters. There's heaps of cardboard counters for victory point tokens and for your troops and for independent troops. And there's a little score pad in the bottom as well. These little counters used to be miniatures in the first version of the game. Miniatures are totally unnecessary for this game, and I'm quite happy with these cardboard ones. They do the job. Who needs all those miniatures? It just made the game more expensive. The bulk of the game is all these cards, and as you can see, there are heaps and heaps of them. And you get quite a lot of variety. In fact, you get the original expansion for the game has been included in this version. So you've got all the Tyrants of the Underdark content in one box. They're made up of multiple decks. I've got 2, for example, here of different types, which are identified by a little icon in the bottom corner. And you put 2 of these decks together to play the game that you're going to play. So you've got a lot of variety. You can mix and match these decks to add variety to the game. And here we have Tyrants of the Underdark all set up for play with 2 players. Now, it's a 2 to 4 player game, and you use different parts of the board depending how many players you have. So with a 2 player game, you just play with this central section. It's defined by these dotted lines on either side. A 3 player game, you add one of the sections. A 4 player game, you have the entire board. When you set up, you put these control tokens on these locations. There are 3 of them with a 2 player game. And these control tokens consist of a control side, which gives you a little bonus, and a total control side, which gives you the same bonus plus some victory points. You also set up these counters, which are independent troops. They're basically just getting in the way of you taking over the Underdark. And they're placed on all the locations that have the same symbol on them to start with. This is the cardboard. We've got the market deck here, which consists of the 2 decks that you choose to use during your game. You put 6 of those cards out on here, so this is a little market for you to choose from and buy your cards to build your deck. You've got some victory point tokens in this space here. There's lots more victory tokens, really. They don't really fit in this space very well, but you can put a few on there if you want to, or put it in a separate container. And over here you've got some standard units, the House Guard and Priestess of Lolth. They're the standard ones that you can also buy. One gives you power, one gives you influence. I'll get into that in a moment. Each player, of course, has their player board, which isn't really necessary, especially when you've got the Esoteric Order of Gamers reference. But if you want to, there's a space for your deck, there's a space for your discards. You can put all your troops down here in the barracks. I've just got them over here because I've run out of space on the table. And when you assassinate other troops, whether your opponents or independent troops, you put them here in the trophy hall because every counter has got a little 1 victory point marker on the back because they're all worth 1 victory point at the end of the game. You've also got some spies, which you can place on locations. Someone's got the first player token, and you draw 5 cards to start with. Starting with the first player, you place a starting troop on one of the black locations, which are the starting sites. Both players do that, and then you're ready to start.
Tyrants of the Underdark is a rather clever combination of 2 classic types of gaming: deck building and area control, and they work so smoothly together in this game. You wonder more people haven't thought of it before. It is the kind of thing that's taking off though. Dune Imperium is another game that comes to mind that has both deck building and area control elements. Though come to think of it, in that game you're actually selecting areas to do various things, where in this one it's more classic area control. You're trying to have the most number of troops in each one of the locations to win the victory points there. Now you get control of one of these spaces on the board by having the most number of troops in that area. So if you have an equal number of troops with your opponent or with the independent troops, you haven't got control. The main locations can give you a victory point reward if you have total control of it, but the other locations only score at the end of the game, so there's a lot of grabbing locations, having the other person grabbing them, a lot of tit-for-tat kind of gameplay. In classic deck building form, you've got 5 cards and you're going to use them all each turn to buy other cards and to do things. There are 2 currencies, influence and power. Influence pretty much lets you buy cards, power lets you move your troops around and assassinate troops and do things like that. So when you start the game, you've got 2 different types of units, the soldiers, which give you 1 power each, and the nobles, which give you 1 influence each. So for example, on my first turn, I've got 5 cards. I'll have a combination of power and influence here, and that's my pool of power and influence that I can use to buy the cards from the market or move my troops around on the board. So for example, on my first turn, I might have a 2 influence. I can spend that 2 influence to buy a Priestess of Loth card. There's the cost in the top right-hand corner, and it goes into my discard pile to start with. Later on, when it gets shuffled into my deck and I draw it, it can give me 2 influence, so it's just that little bit more powerful than a noble. So apart from buying cards, what other things can I do on my turn? Well, there's a whole selection of them. Some of them you need to play cards to do, some of them they're just standard actions. So on any turn, I could spend 3 power to assassinate a troop. And that means I basically kill one of the troops on the board and it goes into my trophy hall and is worth 1 victory point at the end of the game. I can also deploy a troop by spending 1 power, taking one of my troops and putting it on the board. Also, if an opponent has a spy on the board, I can expend 3 power to return it to them and get it off the board. Now for all these actions I need something called presence, which is just a fancy way of saying I have to have a troop adjacent to where I'm taking the action. I can't just do it anywhere on the board. And this way you get a feeling of your troops spreading out over the board, taking over locations. Spies, however, if you have a card that allows you to deploy one, you can place anywhere, so you can get presence in locations that aren't linked to your troops, and that gives you a bit more flexibility. The other good thing about spies is that they stop your opponents getting total control of a site if you have a spy there. Now, as you start getting more powerful cards in your hand, they go into your discard pile, they get shuffled into your hand, you can start playing them. You can buy more powerful cards, obviously, as you have more influence. But these cards also give you access to new abilities. You can do things like devour a card, which means you can take it out of the market and put it in the devoured cards space and draw a new one. By the way, every time you buy a card, you immediately replace it with a new one. You can, of course, place a spy somewhere if a card allows you to. You can promote a card, and this is a way of getting some of the cards out of your deck, because once it's promoted and placed next to your player board, it's no longer part of your deck, and you get a higher victory point reward for it at the end of the game. You can also supplant a troop, so you can replace one of the enemy troops on the board with one of your own. And really, that's about it. It's super easy. I won't go into huge detail, of course, this is just an overview, but basically, you're building up a stronger deck as you go. You're using that to send your troops over the board and take control of locations, assassinating other troops as you go and getting victory points for that, and extending your reach over the Underdark, so you get the most victory points at the end of the game. When you get control of one of these major locations, you get the control token. Now, if you have more troops there than the independent troops and other players, you have control, so you get this marker and it gives you an extra influence. If you have total control, which means you occupy all the spaces in that location, you get the total control side, which gives you that extra influence and also victory points at the end of each turn. So it's really good to get control of those large locations. The game ends when you run out of cards in the market deck or a player runs out of troops, and then it's time to score. And you've got a little scoring pad to help you through this process, but what you have to do is add up the victory point value of each site that you control on the board, which means you have more troops than anyone else at that location. There's 2 victory points for each site under your total control, which means you have all the spaces filled with your troops. You get 1 victory point for each troop in your trophy hall that you've killed during the game. You get the victory point value of each one of your cards, and this is the deck value, which is the left-hand icon on the bottom of the card, and it's the lower victory point value. If during the game you promoted any cards, you get the larger victory point value for them. Finally, you add your victory point tokens that you gain from having total control over the large sites during the game. You add all these up and the person with the most victory points wins. So, what do I think of Tyrants of the Underdark? Well, I think it's fun. I enjoy it. There's nothing particularly new or challenging about this game design. I just like the way it very smoothly blends these two genres. I'm not a huge fan of deck building, as I think I've mentioned before, and I get a bit, when it starts and I have to sort of buy the boring cards, and there's this particular process you have to go through before you start getting interesting cards. You know, that buy and sell, shuffle your deck, blah, blah, blah. Well, the shuffling is a bit annoying, but, that's part and parcel of this type of game. Yeah, that kind of phase I'm not too crazy about, though, of course, other people enjoy that. My opponent, Dylan, enjoys that start of the game where you're starting to decide what cards you want to buy and building up your deck. I find it a bit of a sort of process that you just have to go through. But that's standard for deck building. It makes it more interesting to have the area control element on the board. And you do feel as if your troops are going out and getting more locations and you're getting more powerful as you get more cards and more abilities to do things and be sneaky and nasty and beat your opponent. That said, this is a pretty kind of tit-for-tat, nasty kind of game. It can be frustrating when you get a location after some effort and then your opponent just comes along and assassinates one of your troops and gets control of it. There's a lot of back and forth as locations go from player to player. And of course, as you get near the end of the game and you realise that scoring is drawing near, that gets even nastier. And the whole board can change very suddenly as you play cards and reveal your strategies, which is, an interesting part of the game. But you've got to be prepared that it is quite competitive and a little bit nasty. I kind of like that, but, some people don't like that kind of thing. Obviously, there's a whole lot of content here. There are 6 different decks, and you have 2 per game, so a lot of combinations of decks are possible there. And even though there's only a standard number of actions that you can do, I'm looking forward to exploring the other decks and seeing how they shake up the game. I'm hoping there's some interesting combos in there. I haven't had time to explore all that yet. There are only some very basic combos in the basic 2 starter decks, but that's going to bring me back to the game so I can explore that further. So what are my criticisms of Tyrants of the Underdark? Well, I find the whole gameplay a little bit bland. That's just because I've seen this kind of thing before. Putting them together is new, sure, but the deck building element by itself is pretty standard stuff. The area control stuff is pretty standard stuff. It's just putting them together that makes it a little bit more interesting. I wouldn't rush back to play it constantly, but I'm happy to have it as part of my collection, and I'll go back to it when I want a sort of relatively short, fun game, and I don't have to do any brain burning. It's very easy to pick up and play. My main criticism, however, is the theme and the presentation. Now, I don't know how many people are going to be interested by a theme of drow dark elves fighting in the Underdark. You really could have applied this theme to pretty much anything. I could see it being a Game of Thrones game or anything that involves influence, power, getting troops, buying more cards. I mean, that could really be applied to any kind of theme. And it's the Dungeons & Dragons players who will recognise this theme. My opponent Dylan had no idea what the drow were or the Dark Elves and no interest and found the theme quite boring. I have some connection to the theme only because I played D&D back in the day and I had the old module Vault of the Drow, which is the module that introduced the Dark Elves and the fact that they lived underground and were sneaky and had all these politics and fights going on all the time. In more modern times, I haven't really followed what's going on with Dungeons & Dragons, so the theme is pretty meaningless. But unfortunately, as a graphic designer, I found the visual design very bland. I've seen this style before in Castle Ravenloft. It seemed to be the style of the last generation of Dungeons & Dragons, where for some reason they went for this very minimal, kind of bland style. And it's a shame, really, that since this is a new edition, it didn't get a visual revamp. I know the idea is probably to get this game out at the lowest price point possible so a lot of people can enjoy it, and I think that's great. But when you look at the board, it's really not very interesting. The card artwork is fine, but the graphic design is bland. I mean, look at the backs of the cards. It's just a purple card with Minion written on it. I'm really missing a sense of immersion and excitement in the theme visually. I don't feel like I'm immersed in this world, and that's something that's pretty important for me when it comes to games.
Oh, and these names are just ridiculous.
So again, folks, this is just my personal opinion. I do recommend Tyrants of the Underdark if you're into deck builders and area control and you'd like to see how they work together. It does work absolutely fine, and it's a fun game to play. I've got nothing against it. I just wish that it was a bit more thematic and immersive, and I really felt like one of these sneaky dark elf leaders trying to consolidate their power in the Underdark. Well, that's it, folks. I hope you've enjoyed my look at Tyrants of the Underdark board game by Gale Force 9. There are more reviews of Gale Force 9 games and lots of other games coming on the Esoteric Order of Gamers YouTube channel, so stay tuned, subscribe, hit all notifications, and look out for that new stuff. Of course, visit the website. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rule summaries and reference sheets for you to download and enjoy. Lots of stuff to check out there. Thanks very much for watching. Oh, and check me out on social media too and the Patreon channel. Bye for now.